afternoon to one and all present here, and welcome back to the third day program to witness the day 3 webinar on Women in Wildlife Conservation organized to commemorate the Wildlife Week celebration by ICAS Club Department of Zoology. Hearty welcome to faculty members, students, and our esteemed resource person, Dr. Nikita Prakash, research biologist. The resource person of today is Dr. Nikita Prakash, who played a vital role in vulture conservation breeding program initiated to conserve the three types of vultures who are endangered species, and she and her husband are involved in artificial incubation of the vulture eggs so that they could release it into the environment and make it revive back the lost species. And so far, she has hatched over 300 eggs of all the three species: white-backed vulture, long-billed vulture, and slender-billed vulture. And she imparts training to biologists and veterinarians of various vulture conservation breeding centers in India as well as South Asia. She has trained staff from various international places like Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. They maintain the database of vulture breeding program on software called Sparks, and she has been inspiring, and she has been conferred with the prestigious award Wildlife Conservation Protection by Haryana government in 2008. She has been involved in this program for many years, and we are looking forward to her wonderful and informative speech. Over to Dr. Nikita Prakash.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it is a very good opportunity for me to talk to all the young girls. I'm very, very happy to talk about vulture conservation program to all of you. I am in the north, you are all in the south, but this is such a good platform, and thank you very much once again. So I shall be talking on the vulture conservation efforts that has been going on from last 20 years in India. And this is the outline of my talk, and the first section is introduction. So vultures are scavengers. They never hunt or kill. They feed only on dead animals to survive. And they do a very efficient job in this and keep our environment clean. If there is a cattle carcass of an adult cow of 300-400 kilos, these vultures will clear it within no time and convert it into bag of bones. So nothing is left to putrefy. And they are very efficient because not only do they clear carcasses of animals which have been preyed upon by big cats like lion and tiger, but they also seek out carcasses which have died because of other ailments like maybe old age or any sickness, disease, or any accident or any epidemic. So they clean all this rotting meat, and it is a very difficult way of survival to continue to remain a scavenger, because it is not that the dead animal is going to die at its feet. These birds have to go out and search for dead animals, So it is a very difficult way of surviving, but they have been very successful, and from time immemorial they are into scavenging. This is because they are very mobile. They can travel long distance in search of food because they use the thermals, the hot air currents that are rising from the ground on which they hop, like we use our buses, and we change one bus to another bus to reach our location. They change thermals to travel long distance. Thereby, they don't consume any energy, and they can travel far and wide. And they are, because they are social birds, they all feed together. So while they are in flight, if they see a carcass on the ground with dogs and crows and other scavenging birds, one of them will come down when it is descending, it is an advertise to the other birds that are flying in the vicinity that come, there is food here. So vultures from far and wide will come down in a cascading effect and swoop upon the carcass and convert it into a bag of bones in no time. Moreover, they have a very elastic a crop at the base of the neck, which is very elastic, and they can store food as much as their body weight. So any animal or even we humans cannot consume more than 5% of our body weight in one meal, but vultures can consume as much as their body weight, that is 4 to 5 kilos. Then they can remain hungry for several days. So when if suppose if there is an epidemic somewhere, then these birds can travel hundreds of kilometers onto that all the dead animals and consume it, and they can fly away thereafter. Then no other terrestrial scavenger can travel long distance, and they do not help each other in feeding, and they cannot eat as much as their body weight. So that's why these birds are very efficient and very successful in scavenging. They are not opportunists. Like kites and eagles, sometimes they hunt, sometimes they scavenge, but vultures are only into scavenging all along. So we had approximately 4 crore vultures in our country in the early 80s, in the whole of the 80s. And this is the picture of a housing colony in the center of Delhi. And the housing colony had a carcass dump besides it, where carcasses from all around Delhi were being offloaded, and people were living in this housing colony, and they never smelt the stench, because vultures were all the times clearing the carcasses. So and this huge number was because in our country cattle rearing is a very big business due to dairy farming and agriculture practices. So there was a lot of food, and in the absence of an organized carcass disposal system, all this food was being consumed by the vultures, so their population was huge. We had an estimated 4 crore vultures, and vultures benefited from man, and we also benefited from them, because they kept our environment clean. And the bone and hide industry, leather industry is a very lucrative industry. So the hide collector, even before the dogs could get to the hide, the vultures would feed. Once if the dogs have laid their teeth on the hide, that hide is not good, because they tear it very badly. But the vultures did a very neat job, so the hide collector could get very good money. And the vultures don't let anything to putrefy, so the bones were fresh, and that's why that industry was flourishing in presence of vultures. Even Parsis, they don't like to offer their dead to the 5 elements: water, air, sky, fire, and so they offer their dead to the vultures, and that is the most ecologically friendly way of disposing the dead, because you don't use any raw material. So we all benefited from vultures, and vultures benefited from us. So it was a win-win situation for both for several years. But in the late 90s, we saw a little change in the vulture population. This was because of very good documentation of data. So Bombay Natural History Society was working in Kevladev National Park in the 80s, and Dr. Vibhu Prakash, for his PhD program, was studying raptor community in Kevladev National Park, which is in Rajasthan. It is a 29 square kilometer area. And he used to conduct weekly censuses and count raptors. And because vultures are raptors, he used to count vultures also in those weekly censuses. So he had data. And in 1986-87, he had counted more than 350 nests in the park of white-backed vultures. So that is more than 700 breeding individuals. We are not considering the non-breeding individuals. And 29 square kilometer would be like 24 individuals in a 1 square kilometer area. That's a huge density. Then again, Bombay Natural History Society has been conducting raptor surveys nationwide once in every 4 years. And so we did nationwide surveys, as well as again when we had another project in Bharatpur in 96-97, we started working in the park and doing weekly census. So we counted less than 150 nests. And by 2000, there was absolutely no breeding in the park and no vultures were sighted. So that was a really alarming situation. And we could not comprehend what was causing this. So, and on the basis of the nationwide surveys that we were doing, can I hide this? It's okay. Sorry. We realized that we had lost by 2007. We had lost like for 99.9% of our white-backed vultures. So that was a very big crash in the population, and we were seeing an average 43% decline every year. So that was, and we were trying to find out the cause of mortality, and with in 2015 again we did several surveys between 2000 and 2015, and we realized that the whitebacks population was probably stabilizing and it was also increasing, but now the population is so small that we cannot remain complacent and we cannot stop working on these species because there is a looming extinction probable. So that's why we are still working on them, and longbills still continue to decline. So the usual, so the consequences of vulture decline were these. We were encountering carcasses which were rotting, and you can see maggots developing here, and all these will develop into flies. But what you do not see is the multiplying of bacteria and fungus, and they will go and putrefy our water, oil, air, soil, and they'll form a spore, become immortal, and when they come across a healthy host, they will attack and cause diseases, spread diseases. So this is what is happening in the wild when vultures were not there. Also, dog population had increased many folds, and we saw that the dogs were littering in the carcass dump in the rib cage of the carcass. The pups were growing, feeding on so much food, they had become more ferocious, and because there was no contact with the humans, they were getting all food from these carcass dumps. When they come across humans, they would bite. So this was a very critical situation, and it was very alarming. So we started looking out for the causes of vulture decline. So usually the ecological factors are mortality of the species and breeding failure, which we were seeing, and this could have been because of any paucity of food or habitat, or chemical contamination. But nothing of that was visible because there was a lot of food, but only 5% of the carcasses were being attended by the vultures. Well, and there was no paucity of habitat because vultures occur from desert to evergreen forest, and they can utilize trees, houses, or cliffs. And even if the trees and cliffs are not available, then they can utilize rooftops. So there was no paucity of food. There was not enough load of pesticide. Pesticide can cause breeding failure, as it has done in some species in the abroad, like bald eagles and Mauritian kestrel. But that was also not visible here because we did not find that kind of load in the vulture tissues. So we were trying to figure out, and we used to see vultures like this with drooping neck and ruffled feathers, not able to take care of itself. But if you approach this bird, it will fly away, and then it will go and die somewhere else. So it was not like a poisoning case where the vultures die there and there itself on the carcass after feeding. They were dying somewhere else. That's why it was difficult to get carcasses. However, whichever carcass we opened, we used to see visceral gout condition in their postmortem, that is deposition of uric acid on the visceral organs. So visceral gout in humans is arthritis of bones, where where uric acid deposits on the bones, but in birds it is arthritis of the visceral organs. So uric acid, this was, we did not know what is causing visceral gout, but due to our alarm, American scientists of Peregrine Fund were working in Pakistan. They also had some birds in captivity, vultures, and they used to feed them. And one day they fed on what food that several birds died. So they had an access to um, fresh clinical samples, and they found visceral gout condition as well as diclofenac residues in the vulture tissues. So they realized that the buffalo which they had fed, the buffalo meat, could have diclofenac. So they injected a buffalo with diclofenac, and then they fed that meat to vultures, and vultures died. And when the postmortem was carried out, they found visceral gout symptoms on that vulture. So they knew diclofenac was the cause of mortality. When we came to know of this, we had stored all the samples in our freezers, and we opened them again, and we realized that yes, it's the similar situation here also. There was a perfect relation between visceral gout and diclofenac. So we were, we tried to find out how vultures could have got exposed to diclofenac, and we came to know that if a cattle is sick and is treated with diclofenac, and if the cattle survives, that is good for the cattle. But in case if it dies, and within 72 hours of administration, if such a carcass is, available to vultures for feeding, then the vultures die of kidney failure because they are not able to excrete the uric acid, and that uric acid goes and deposits on the visceral organs, and it is a very painful death for the vulture. So we were a bit, shocked that this is too much of a coincidence that a cattle should fall sick and then be treated with diclofenac and should die within 72 hours of administration, so that it has not excreted the diclofenac out of the body, and then such a carcass should be available to vultures for feeding. So we were not very sure, because first of all, we have a huge population of cattle. Not all cattle is treated. Only 5% of the cattle is treated. Rest of them do some home remedy, or they are just left out in the open, in the wild, when they are not milking. So we were not sure if this is true or not. So we contacted one Professor Green of Cambridge University, and he, with the help of a population model, found out that even if less than 1% of carcasses with diclofenac are available to the feeding vultures, then this kind of crash is possible, because vultures feed in flocks. So if a carcass has diclofenac, and if 400, 500 vultures feed on that, then all those birds will die. So that was the cause of mortality, and that gave us a path to move forward. We immediately contacted the government, and they, fortunately for the birds, they took a swift action. They formulated a vulture action plan in 2006 with the following recommendations: that we should find an alternative to diclofenac. Only then the diclofenac can be banned, and then we should start with a conservation breeding program in order to save these vultures from looming extinction. So we conducted a global survey of all the zoos which keep scavenging birds in the captivity, and we circulated a questionnaire to them on what medicines do they use to treat their birds. And we came, several options came up, but meloxicam was the safest option we found, because that had not caused any mortality on the scavenging birds. All these are NSAIDs, and if an NSAID is toxic, the blood parameters will rise. So the uric acid will have a very big rise, which can be harmful to the bird or animal. So meloxicam did not cause any rise in the blood parameters. So we conducted a safety testing of meloxicam on our vultures in Pinjore, and we found that all our vultures were safe. There was no harmful effect of meloxicam on their blood parameters. And so again, we approached the Drug Controlling Authority, Government of India, and they banned diclofenac in 2006. And they also mentioned that we should use an alternative, safe and effective drug like meloxicam. So that was, we thought that that is very good for vultures and vultures are safe. But we realized that vultures were still dying of diclofenac because human formulations of multi-dose vials of diclofenac had filtered into the um, veterinary sector. So that was again a big concern because we humans, we for our profit and economics, we manufacture big vials of 30 ml doses when actually we require only a 3 ml ampule. And vultures, cattle requires 10 to 15 ml dose. So it became very easy for the veterinarians to buy a big bottle and inject twice, and the cattle is treated with diclofenac. So it took us quite a long time to convince the government that we should ban these multi-dose vials. But finally, in 2015, the Drug Controlling Authority banned multi-dose vials of human formulations, and now only 3 ml ampules would be available in the market for human use, and this notification will reduce the prevalence of diclofenac in the veterinary system. So till all this was going on, we had to start with the conservation breeding programs also. This is not the best tool, but this was the only option left with us, because it's always good to conserve birds in the wild. But due to the presence of diclofenac, we thought of bringing some population of birds in captivity, increase their numbers till the environment outside is safe, and then release the birds again in the wild. And that's why in 2004, we set up the first vulture conservation breeding center in Pinjore, Haryana. And that was initially a care center, but when diclofenac was detected, thereafter we started with the conservation breeding program, and the center was upgraded into a breeding center. And thereafter we set up another center in West Bengal, a third center in Assam, and fourth center in Bhopal in 2013. Other 4 centers are being supported by Central Zoo Authority, but technical expertise and provision of birds is done by us from our centers to them. So in our conservation breeding program, we are working on these 3 species, the long-billed, slender-billed, and the white-backed vultures. These are resident vultures, resident to our country. That is, they live all year round, breed all year round in our country. They are not migratory. They don't go out. They don't come here only during winters. They live in our country all the year round. When we decided to start a conservation breeding program, there were many questions in our mind, many doubts, like how many birds to keep, how will we keep them, for how long will we keep them, what will be the financial implications. And so vulture recovery plan was worked out, and we found, taking into consideration their general ecology and their breeding biology, their feeding biology, with the help of a statistical model, we worked out that if we could release 600 pairs of each of the 3 species in the wild, that will be a genetically viable, self-sustaining population. And to acquire this 600 pairs, we would require 25 pairs of each of the 3 species at one center, which will produce 100 pairs in 15 years' time, and 6 centers will produce 600 pairs. And the first release will be initiated from 2020. So after the first release is initiated, then in another 10 years, we are supposed to release 600 pairs. So that was the timeline that was given to us, and we developed this center on this 5 acres of Haryana Forest Department land. There are different aviaries of different sizes for different purposes, and all our centers in the country have a similar layout. So when a bird is brought for the conservation breeding program, it is first quarantined for 45 days, and that is this facility is 5 kilometers away from our center, because disease is a very big problem. If a disease can wipe all your collection, that's why we keep them 5 kilometers away from our center in a quarantine aviary. And there is a disease called Rani Khet disease, which is which has an incubation period of 45 days. So in case if any bird is affected by this, then the symptoms will definitely show. So during the 45 days, we do their blood sampling, fecal sampling, and if they are declared healthy, then they are brought to the center. So if it is a juvenile nestling, they are housed in these nursery aviaries. If it's a juvenile, then it goes into this holding aviary. And if they are adult or sub-adult birds, then they are housed in these colony aviaries. So these are big aviaries. They are like 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, 20 feet high. And, we house sub-adult and adult birds here so that they breed and live comfortably just as they would in the wild. And we try to give them all facilities and keep them as natural as possible. So because they have to be released and they have to settle back in the wild. So the aviaries are open to sky, and there are big windows for good light and ventilation. And there are these nest cots, and concrete ledges are provided to them. And there is this water trough. There are 4 water troughs, one on each corner. So birds use this for drinking and taking bath. And this is the food hatch from where food is passed. Everything is done remotely. We throw food inside. We don't go in every time we have to feed them, because that can be very stressful for them. And all the windows are covered with bamboos to provide them with isolation from our activity that is going on outside. This is the window from where we provide nest material to them during the breeding season. So all the facilities are done remotely, and because if they are stressed, then they will not breed. And if they don't breed, then the whole aim of the program is to increase their number in captivity. So once thereafter, we have other aviaries like these display aviaries and hospital aviaries, because we are working with live birds. Injury, sickness can be, very frequent. So we can house them and treat them here. And we have breeding aviaries. There are some birds which, get injured due to kite strings. That is very fatal for the birds. But we have been able to save them by bringing them to our breeding program, and by giving them food and water on the ground, and they have survived. Otherwise in the wild they would have died. But many a times these birds, in their wings, they develop maggots, and then they get infected and they have to be treated with medicines and all that. That can be very stressful. And if they are kept in big aviaries, again, that can be a problem for them. So such birds are kept in these breeding aviaries, and they have done very well. They give us healthy nestlings. So we have that also for them. Then before introducing them into our collection, we wing tag them. That is, there is this space in the wing where there are less blood vessels, like how our ear lobes are pierced. So there we put a patagium tag, which is which helps to identify the bird easily even from far. And then these leg bands are there, which has a unique number, which is easy to identify the bird. And on the pectoral muscles, we insert a microchip. So this microchip remains forever in the body, and in case if the bird dies also, by just putting the reader of the microchip near this pectoral muscle, you can see the ring number and you can identify the bird. Thereafter, all its measurements are noted, and then we also have a very good lab, hematology lab, where all the blood work is done, biochemistry, which tells you all the blood profile, and microbiology, which has not been done anywhere. So we know the gut fauna and flora of these birds. And these birds are not molecular, are not sexually dimorphic. So by molecular sexing, we can tell whether they are, you can identify their sex. So all this is done in our center. And then the way I'll show you how we keep them here. So this is how we feed them. We feed them on goat meat only because goats are easy to procure, and goats are usually not treated with any medicine. Plus, in case if they are treated also, we keep them with us for 7 days, by when they are definitely going to excrete the medicine out, and then they are slaughtered, and whole goats are given to the birds. The skin is removed because these birds don't feed on skin. There are other vultures like king vulture and cinereous vulture which feed on skin. And in case if the king vulture and cinereous vultures are not there, these vultures, these three species, white-backed, long-billed, slender-bill, they feed on the inner visceral organs, and they enter inside the body through the natural openings and feed upon the inner organs. So, and skin rots very fast. So every time you feed the birds, you have to go and remove the skin. So that will be very disturbing them. So we remove the skin, and then the birds are provided with the food. And you see, they all feed together. There is no hierarchy. And the hungriest bird is the most dominant. It feeds, but it allows other birds also to feed. And within no time, all this food will be converted into a bag of bones. So nothing is left to rot or decay. After feeding, they take bath. They love taking bath, and you feel they are dirty birds. They eat dirty food, but they are very clean birds. And you see here also, there are no fights. One after the other they come in, and they take a very good bath. They will dip one wing, then the other wing, and their face, their tail, and if you don't provide them with fresh water, then they don't take bath. So every day this water has to be changed, not changed, sorry, topped with fresh water. Every third day we change the whole water, and every seventh day we change the water troughs. So there are 4 water troughs. 2 are kept wet and 2 are kept dry, so that there is no algal deposition on the water troughs. Then whenever there is good sunshine, they open their wings, and the sun is a very good disinfectant, so they shed their ectoparasites. And this activity is called preening. So there is a oil gland at the base of the tail, from which they pick up oil and rub through the ratchets and keep their feathers well combed and shiny. If it is a healthy bird, it will always look well combed. No feather is out of place. But if it is a sick bird, it will have ruffled feathers. The feathers will be full of lices. It's not able to take care of itself. It will sit on the ground. It will remain isolated from other birds. It won't feed in company of other birds. Those are all the signs of sick bird. But all these are healthy birds because they are able to do all this and keep themselves shiny. Because of this back, this particular species is called a white-backed vulture. And whenever there is good breeze, they will vigorously flap their wings and keep their pectoral muscles in shape. And if they are able to do this, then they will fly as soon as we release them in the wild, because their feathers have not stiffened up because they were in captivity for so many years. No, they will fly because they are able to do this exercise and keep themselves healthy and fit. And see how vigorous this exercise is, because we do not feed them every day. We underfeed them because they do not find food every day also in the wild. So here also they are kept in near natural conditions. But these birds they get into adulthood at 5 years of age. But from 3 years of age, they start pairing. So here a bird is offering a twig to the other bird. If the other bird accepts, then they become a pair. And then once they become a pair, they remain together for the rest of the life. In case if there is a bird, one of them falls sick or dies, then there are other birds which will take over. Within a couple of hours, a new pair will form. But otherwise, and they lay fertile eggs only after 5 years. So between two big birds, and their lifespan is between 35 to 40 years. So it's between two big birds, they lay only one egg, that too after 5 years of age. So say from 5 years to 40 years, they have laid 35 eggs. All 35 eggs will not hatch, only 50% will hatch. That means you will have some 15, 16 eggs from them. And all 16 eggs will not fledge. And all 16 nestlings. There again, there is mortality. So you will get only 8 to 10 chicks from two big birds in their lifespan. So that is why they are called slow breeding and long living birds. So in such birds, even if the population dent is like 5%, that population is difficult to revive. And I told you earlier, we were seeing 43% annual decline. So these birds are, facing a probable looming extinction, and that's why captive breeding program was the only option left with us. That's why we took up this conservation breeding program. Nesting at the center is very much as we see in the wild. In the wild also, birds begin forming a pair from September, October. They locate a nest, they build a nest, which all takes 2 months. Then they lay an egg. So egg is incubated for another 2 months, that is 4 months. And then the chick hatches and remains on the nest for 4 months. So it is a 8-month breeding cycle. Only 4 months they are free. That's why they can take care of only one chick at a time, because it is very intensive for them. So that's why they lay only one egg. And this is how they pick up nest material. So we provide, just a minute. We provide nest material on the ground, and they pick up the, sorry, this video is not working, but they pick up nest material and they bring on the nest, and then both birds build the nest together. So at the moment they become a pair, then everything they do together, they share all responsibilities together. And it takes almost 2 months to build this nest. And initially we thought that it's taking too long. Why don't we provide nest material on the nest itself? But they didn't like it at all. They just threw out all the material and they build their own nest, because that is the way of strengthening their pair. And then it's time to lay egg. And see here, the female is going to lay an egg. It's usually done from between dawn and dusk. This is because we could record this video because of CCTV camera that are placed in our aviaries. And so we, all these years we thought that the female would be sitting to lay an egg, but she's standing. So this is something new that, in spite of being in this field for so many years, every day we learn something new, isn't it? So, and then after the egg is laid, then it is another 2 months, approximately 55 days is the incubation period. And, they don't leave their egg alone. If one has to go down to feed or take rest, only when the other bird comes, they will leave the nest. And this is their territory that they defend during the breeding season. Outside breeding season, any number of birds can come and sit here. And we provide them with rough surface, because just like if our feet keep pinching because of a new shoe, or we have bed sores, similarly they also have something like that, and that will develop into bacterial infection called bumblefoot on their feet, because the feet are holding a surface in captivity all the time. So that's why if you provide them with rough surface, then that will divide the pressure and that will prevent bumblefoot. So we have, the bumblefoot is an irreversible condition, and then the bird will ultimately die. So we have to be very careful about bumblefoot infections in captivity. By providing this rough surface, we can avoid that. And eggs are rolled 5 to 6 times in a day for uniform development of the chick and for taking up all the nutrient that is there in the metabolic water inside. And both the birds do this activity for their eggs. Incubation stints can be very long, so whenever the bird gets up, it stretches itself thoroughly, just like we would do if we were sitting in one position for long. So see how well it stretches itself. And you see there is an egg at the base of the nest. This is a long-billed vulture. This requires cliffs to nest. So here also we have provided them with concrete ledges on which they nest, and slenderbills and whitebacks require trees. They nest on trees. And this activity is called preening. It's time to hatch now, almost 2 months into incubation, and both the parents are going round and round trying to help the chick to come out. And in case if they think that the chick is having a problem in hatching, then one of them goes and takes a dip in the water, comes and sits wet on the egg to moisten the egg shell, which will help the chick to break open the egg. And they feed on the egg shell also, because that is a source of calcium. So wherever vultures are, nothing is left to rot. And see, the rings are very clearly visible. So that is a good identity marker. And after the chick hatches, it hatches with a very sparse coat of down. So it is not able to control its body temperature. So the parents sit on it and keep it, warm, because it is month of January, or cool if it is very sunny and from the rains. But after 45 days, the chick has its own thermoregulation, and then it does not require parents. It is independent. Well, at the time of feeding, both the parents are on the nest. So the food that we have provided on the ground, they bring in their crop, and the chick is all the times hungry and begging for food, calling for food, and it in fact keeps pecking on the beak, and the bird regurgitates. And they also bring big bones on the nest for the nestling to feed, because the calcium requirement is very high. And that's why we don't remove the bones as soon as the birds have fed, because these bones are used by the adults and the chick. And these are the crop. This is the crop. This is a crop. They are all, the parents' crop is always full. The chick has been fed so much it is not able to take care. It is not able to balance, and it topples on itself. So this is the amount of food that they feed to the nestlings. And see how clear the ring numbers are. And at 2 months' time, the chick should be able to stand on its feet. Then that means that we have provided it with good calcium and good food. Because if it doesn't stand at this time, then a problem called metabolic bone disease has inflicted, where the bones are weak and the chick will not stand forever in its life. That can be a big burden on the breeding program. So that's why we have to be very careful in providing calcium to them, enough calcium. Now we have succeeded, and we have formed protocols which we want all the other centers of in the country. Pinjore Center is the coordinating zoo for other centers, the other 8 centers, and for uniformity of management and success of this program, these protocols are being followed everywhere. Over the years, we have like 766 birds in our centers in the country, and the major population is from Pinjore, 371 birds, and we have hatched 444 birds in all these years. Again, 314 are from Pinjore. This is because we do artificial incubation, double clutching, and chick swapping. And that's why we have been able to hatch successfully all these 3 species, which has never happened anywhere in the world. So we do artificial incubation mainly to increase their numbers, because these are critically endangered birds. That's why, and to save birds from parental abandonment. Sometimes, we have brought birds from the wild, and the nestlings grow into adulthood, but they are first-time parents. They do not know how to take care of these, how to incubate. So if they abandon, then all eggs are precious, and that's why we remove those eggs and artificially incubate them. So the breeding season begins from November every year, and by first week of December or so, we remove the eggs. That is like 10 to 14 days of natural incubation, which will, develop an appropriate egg weight loss trend under the parents, and that is good for a successful hatching of the embryo of the egg. And if you remove, if you let the, and then that first egg is removed by us, so they within 10 to 15 days, and they double clutch, that is they recycle, they lay another egg. That we have seen in the wild also, that vultures do this. So that is how we have been able to increase their numbers in captivity. And if you let the egg remain on the nest for long time, like more than a month, then they will not double clutch. So we do artificial incubation and double clutching. So eggs are removed by entering inside the aviary. The nests are located like 14, 15 feet high. And, we carry with us this hand sanitizer and an egg box with a sterilized padding of cotton. And we remove the egg and we mark it on the nest itself, because all the adult pairs in the aviary would have an egg. So I have some 10, 12 aviaries from each, eggs from each aviary. And if you don't mark them, you do not know which egg belongs to whom. That's why it's marked on the egg, on the nest itself, and then brought to the incubator room. So this is how it is padded in the cotton, sterilized cotton, so that there is no jerk which can be harmful to the developing blood vessels of the embryo. And then it is brought to the incubator room. Our incubator room is thermo-controlled. It runs between temperature 19 to 21 degrees for optimum functioning of these incubators. And the humidity is as low as possible. In Pinjore, we have between 25 to 40, but even if the humidity is very high, you can use dehumidifiers to control humidity. And the incubator room is treated as an ICU room. It is a very critical room. So like, it is not a general common room where everybody comes in and goes out. That will invite infections, contamination. So only essential equipment is kept in this room. And access is only to the staff who are working in the incubator room. And we all have to wear dedicated clothing like a lab coat and face mask, and clean our hands with a disinfectant, wear dedicated slippers, all that. And these incubators are tabletop incubators with forced air heating. That is, there is a fan inside which rotates and that revolves the heat. So there is uniform temperature all around for the egg to develop healthy. And these are very simple and efficient incubators where temperature and humidity controls are concerned. So 4 vulture eggs can be incubated at a time in this incubator room. And the incubators have a cradle on which they rock every hour, but we also manually turn the eggs 3 times in a day for uniform development. When the egg comes to the incubator room, that is the current weight. We weigh the egg, we know the current weight of the egg, because we want to estimate the fresh egg weight when it was laid on the first day. And from that, we will calculate how much will be the weight loss between 14 to 17%, and at what weight the egg will hatch. That for successful hatching, this is very important. Why does an egg lose between, like all eggs should lose between 14 to 17%? Because the eggshell is porous, and when the embryo is growing, it requires a lot of energy. So every time fat breaks down, water is the byproduct which is given out, but this is metabolic water. And so huge amount of energy is required, so there will be huge amount of water produced, but the embryo can drown in that water. So that's why water evaporates. The egg is in itself built that the eggshell is porous, and water evaporates from there, what the moisture. If this evaporation is too much, then there will be a very fast egg weight loss, where we pour water in the incubator to control the weight loss by increasing humidity. So by reverse osmosis, you can control the weight loss. So there are wells in the bottom of this incubator where you pour water and you increase humidity. In case if the egg is not losing weight, like it is less than 14%, then we drill the egg So after drilling, the evaporation will take place. But here the evaporation will be so fast that we weigh the egg every day, and when we have acquired the right weight loss, then we seal the egg with a non-toxic glue and tissue paper, and then the weight loss can be controlled. So weight loss is very important for successful hatching. Then after the egg is weighed, then we candle the egg. This is to understand the progress in the egg, whether the egg is fertile or infertile, or what is the air cell progression. This space is called air cell, which increases. And there is oxygen in that, which the embryo will take when it pips internally. And you also come to know the eggshell quality. If there is any crack, then you can seal the crack and you can hatch the egg. So we have the egg is candled once in 6 days to understand the progress. And eggs are turned 3 times in a day, very gently, always from the pointed end, never from the rounded end. And they are turned only, they are not turned round and round, because that can rupture the chalaza, which is holding the embryo, and then the embryo can go and stick with the inner shell membrane. And this activity is done very gently so that the developing embryo does not get injured. That can be detrimental. Eggs are incubated between 36.3 to 9.9 degrees centigrade for all the 3 species. And temperature, maintaining the right temperature is very important, because that will enable the metabolic processes which will occur at the correct rate. Because if you incubate them at higher temperature, then the development of the embryo will not be full. Or if you incubate them at lower temperature, then again the development will be very slow. So you have to be very careful and give them the right temperature. And temperature is noted round the clock and every hour. So we have 3 people working in incubation. One person notes down the day temperature and the other the night temperature, and every hour, because there is a lot of electricity fluctuation, and if there is an increase by even 0.5 degrees centigrade, that can be harmful for the embryo. So after doing all this, at around 40 days, the embryo starts, moving inside, and you can say that, you have done everything right, and now the embryo is ready to hatch. So we weigh the egg once in 3 days, we candle the egg once in 6 days, and we turn the eggs 3 times in a day. We note down temperature round the clock, and then at 40 days, this is a very happy sight of seeing the embryo moving. Around 50 days, the egg is due to hatch now. So I can hear it calling, because it has started with pulmonary respiration, and I know now this is internal PIP, and within 24 hours it will PIP externally. This is called external PIP. So there we shift the egg to a hatcher, which is placed, which has high humidity condition. Water is placed here, and all these eggs are now externally pipped. With that is, they have cracked the eggshell, and another 24 hours, and it will be hatched. It will emerge. Emerging is called hatching. So this is a very intensive time for the embryo, and there is this egg tooth which helps in breaking the egg, and it hatches. So when it hatches with sparse coat of downs, and it rests for 12 hours. Plus it has its own yolk sac, so we don't feed it anything. After 12 hours on empty stomach, it is weighed. Weighing is very important to understand its weight gain, according to which it is fed. And first 2 days we feed only 2 grams of goat meat, very finely minced. And from 3rd day onwards, we feed it with different parts of the body, like liver, heart, muscles, rib bones. And this is how we feed them. So this chick is 7 days old. It does not have proper coordination of its body. So we feed it, and it doesn't have proper eyesight, so it does not know who is feeding it. because imprinting can be a big problem, and for first 7 days we feed it, then after that we pass food in the brooder box itself, and then it's able to feed. We also sun them to expose them to vitamin D3, which is important for direct for assimilation of calcium, just like we humans require vitamin D3. So all these chicks are kept out in the sun from third day onwards. When they are in the brooder boxes in the brooder room, they are kept warm because there is a bulb hanging in the box. If the chick is warm, then it will pant and it will be very cranky. So you know it is very warm. So you lift the bulb, and when it is cold, it will shiver. So you lower the bulb. So you have to monitor them closely and give them the right conditions to grow, and they are always kept in groups. When the chick becomes 15 days, around 15 days old, we give it back to the parents. Because the parents have laid a second egg, we remove the second egg and we incubate that, we hatch that egg and rear that nestling with us in the nursery aviary. The first nestling will be reared by the parents. This is how we have increased their productivity, by doing artificial incubation, double clutching, and chick swapping. Because we thought that the second clutch success was not good enough for us. So that's why we have done this, and we now have more than 80% success, which usually on the nest would be just 50%. And that's how we have increased their number. So there I'm picking up the second egg, marking on the nest itself, and then bringing, and the whole cycle begins again. And then they are kept in groups so that they look at each other and grow. They don't get imprinted on us. Around 2 months, because their feet are still not fully grown, these very flexible bands are put to identify them. And at 4 months, these plastic bands, leg bands, are fitted. These are permanent bands, but they also break, so we microchip them also. And see, one of them is a captive reared chick, and the other hand reared in nursery aviary, and the other is reared by the parents, but they are identical. So at 4 months after they fledge, they are all brought into another aviary, and they all grow together. So there is no question of imprinting on them. And all our data is stored electronically, which is a requirement of the Central Zoo Authority, in Sparks as well as ZIMS program. This is the last aspect of the program, because now we have enough birds, we have hatched enough nestlings. The prevalence of diclofenac is less than 2%, because we do cattle carcass sampling. We go to carcass dumps and we remove, we contact the skinner and remove 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter piece of liver from the cattle, and we test that for prevalence of NSAIDs with the help of LC-MS machine, and that is how we can tell what is the prevalence. So in when we came to know that diclofenac could be the cause, before the ban, the prevalence of diclofenac was like 10%, and after the with a lot of advocacy awareness, we could get it reduced to 2%. And now with 2015's notification on multi-dose vials, we will be able, restriction on them, we will be finding that the reduction is even more. The analysis of these samples is going on, and so we think that we are ready for release of these birds in the wild. This is the Gazette notification of the 2015 restriction on multi-dose vials. So we wanted to have a release of these critically endangered vultures in 2016 itself, but we could not get permission to put a tracking device on them, and that's why we first put them we first thought of releasing 2 Himalayan griffons that were with us for 8 to 10 years, living with these birds in the colony aviaries. We thought we'll do an experiment on them, and if we find that they are successfully released, then we will release our critically endangered birds. So it took almost 2-3 years to get the PTT devices. But before that, we put them in these release aviaries, and we invited the Chief Minister of Haryana, which gave us very good publicity. And as a result of which, the prevalence of diclofenac around our center was quite low. And this release aviary is very near to our center. And these birds have foraging range of minimum 100 kilometers. So in that 100-kilometer radius, we are doing a lot of awareness, uh, informing the people that not to use diclofenac, and we are going to release birds, so please take care of them and all that. So that all the awareness is going on, and we have adopted a soft release approach where we provide food outside for the free ranging birds. So these birds, they are hanging out on tall trees near our center. We give them food. They come every time we provide food. We provide food to our birds also. Here we give them goats with skin also, so that they are aware that what can be expected. And we want an interaction between these birds, so that when we lift this gate, these birds will go out, mingle with this flock, because they are social birds. They will be accepted by the wild birds, and these birds have not seen wilderness because they have hatched in our center. And so these birds will act as guide birds to them, and they will survive. But we will continue to provide food till our birds have settled well in the wild, and they can find their own food, water. Then we know that they have successfully settled, and then we will withdraw. So this is a soft release approach that we have taken. This is the kind of interaction we want. This bird wants to come in, our birds want to go out. And then when the day came to release the Himalayan griffins, before that we gave them a good health check, and these potassium tags were put on their wings. And we could not put a tracking device, but we could follow them for 45 days after release. Mr. Javadekar, the Union Forest Minister, had come. So this is the gate that was lifted with the help of this pulley, which was rolled, which is in a height 50 meters away from the aviary, and the birds were released. So two birds were released. The other birds were, shifted to another aviary. And for first 24 hours, these birds did not go out because there were a lot of people around. But after that, they flew out. And we had provided them with food on the ground, thinking that that will lure them, but nothing lured them. Only when they knew they were safe, there were no people around, then they escaped. And then for several days it hung around our center, which is what we wanted. So this Himalayan griffin is feeding with a free ranging bird in our center itself. We have provided it with food. And then around a week or so after, it flew up to a tree. And from here on, it gradually increased its distance, its perimeter, and it found its own food. Because it's a Himalayan griffin, it walks a lot on the ground, and it found water because the birds are released in the month of June, but you know it was able to find its water also in spite of scarcity of water at that time. And then on 27th day it took to sky, and see, this is its first flight after 8 years of captivity, and see how well it is flying, like a natural wild bird. And it prevents all the man-made structures like poles or trees or houses, and nothing comes in its way. And it also takes to thermals, and increases its height. And it was mocked by other birds also, but nothing affected it. And after 45 days of following it, we lost track, because it flew over the mountain, and then it flew beyond that, which was not possible for us. Big birds, they roost in the same place. They roost in the night, and in the morning also you find it in the same place. So by break of dawn, we would reach the site, and we could then follow it. Several people, like 10-15 people, were following this bird, and that's why for 45 days we could follow it. So we knew that the birds are safe in the wild, and they are surviving. Although after it was released, we have no clue about it. But we did a lot of background work also before releasing these two Himalayan griffins by, uh, identifying the 100-kilometer area around our center and making sure that it has the right habitat, enough amount of food in this area, and there is a free population, there is a wild population of vultures in the area, because our vulture has to go and integrate with that flock, and there is no a low prevalence of diclofenac, less than 1%. So all this background work was done before releasing the bird, and we found that there is a good population of free ranging birds. There was enough food, there was enough food for it to feed, and there was very good habitat also available for the birds. And we used to do pharmacy surveys also to find out what medicines are available. And although diclofenac prevalence was less, meloxicam usage was more, but there are other NSAIDs like ketoprofen, aceclofenac. You know, aceclofenac metabolizes into diclofenac, so that is again a very similar situation, that diclofenac is available. But these medicines have, NSAIDs have come out in absence of diclofenac usage. So we have to work on these NSAIDs now. And we, like I told you, we do cattle carcass liver sampling also. So that is done every year. So all this was done, and we made sure that the habitat was good for the vultures. Now we have these tracking devices, so we have put on our vultures. And yesterday we lifted the gate, and we thought that we are releasing them, but there were again so many people with the forest minister around that these birds did not go out. Today, around lunchtime, around 1 o'clock, wild vultures came down to feed on the carcass, and they even went inside the aviary and fed with our captive birds, and they are all still hanging around. So when these wild vultures will take off, we are expecting that our vultures will also fly off. But all the birds are in the aviary now, free ranging and are captive bred. So we are still waiting for them to fly out. And we do a lot of awareness and advocacy with the officials of different departments, animal husbandry, because cattle treatment is done by veterinarians and untrained vets. So we have to enlighten them about the problem. And with drug controlling authority, because diclofenac, although being a schedule H drug, it is available even without giving any prescription. So that has to be prevented. And we do awareness with schools and colleges and forest classes, because the foresters are, the caretakers of these birds. So if we are doing all this to make sure that the environment is safe for the vultures. And these are all our agencies which support us. We are not alone. We get support from all these agencies, and that's why we have been able to carry on for so many years. Thank you very much. If there are any questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for the informative session, and it's open for discussion.
Thank you, ma'am. This is Priya. I just have to appreciate you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you, ma'am.
It shows the passion you have and the enormous amount of work that you have done so far. I think it is very encouraging. Yes, others may ask questions, and if not, you can even use the chat box to put up the questions. Ma'am can answer. Yes. And I also want to inform the group that Dr. Vibhu Prakash, that is ma'am's husband and one of the senior scientists who has initiated this program, is also with ma'am. So if you have any questions, he would also answer you. So you are really fortunate to have both of them with us today. Thank you to sir also.
It is our pleasure, ma'am. We are also very happy to be with all of you.
Yes.
How long did it take for you to reach the standard procedure which you are following now to breed vultures in captivity. We think that we have reached the standard procedure, but every year we learn, every time we learn something new, and that keeps adding to our protocols. But I think the end of it is that we should be able to hatch healthy chicks, and we should be able to do the same, follow the same protocols year after year, so that we get them healthy, and they are not imprinted on us. So I think that is what is called successful breeding. And we have been doing it since 2010. But in 2010 we did artificial incubation. Then in 2012 we took up double clutching. In 2014 we took up chick swapping. So over the years now we know that we have been doing this successfully. So now the protocols are laid. The next question is, why did you get interested in vultures? Why vultures when there are so many other animals? Do you have a soft spot for these birds? So I was working in Kevladev National Park and I saw a red-headed vulture, king vulture. And it was so attractive that I fell in love with that. And for my PhD, I have studied these vultures, and my PhD topic was general ecology of vultures with special reference to king vultures. At that time, I did not know, this was in 1991, that we will be working on vultures like this. We will be putting 20 years in vultures. But because of my background, then I carried on with vultures. Any other question?
Yes, ma'am. I have one. When you showed us the map, there seem to be, gray places all over the country except in the south of India. Why is it not that there are vulture conservation for the southern states?
We are going to come up with one in Bangalore now, Karnataka. But vultures are naturally very less occurring in South India. Okay. So it is good to work where there was a good population. That's why we are working more in the North India, because North India had a good population at one time, and now it's less. But very soon our center will come up in Karnataka. Ramdevra Hills. Does keeping them in captivity make them so vulnerable? So vulnerable means what? Does keeping them in captivity make them vulnerable? No, they don't become vulnerable. We are keeping them in near natural condition. We are making sure that whenever we release them in the wild, they'll be able to, because their pectoral muscles are in shape, they'll be able to fly. And we don't hand feed them. Any bird which is hand fed will think that the person who's feeding is their parents or their kind, but food is provided to them remotely. So I don't think they are vulnerable here. This captivity is only to protect them from the medicine. When the medicine is removed from the system, then they will be released back in the wild. Where did you get the microchip? Is there any ethical issues while using microchip you come across? Microchips have been imported from US and Germany. And in case if you come across the PTT has been imported from Germany, but microchips have also come from US. And you will not be able to see the microchip. It is in the body. So you cannot remove it. And it is a very small, like a rice grain size, very small, and it doesn't cause any harm to the bird. It remains in the body. Why? Okay, I thought that vultures are some dirty, bad, angry birds, but you told their amazing, essential role for ecological balance. That is a lot for this super amazing session. Thank you very much. That is the aim, to change the view of the general public. That's why I was also very keen on talking to all of you. And you will not believe, people do have all these ideas that, because they hang around dead animals, they are ghosts, or, we are working with all this. But once they come to our center, they see the way we work and the way the birds are kept, then they go with a very different view for vultures. They are very happy. Thank you very much. Is there any incidents that a vulture imprinted on the people work on these captive breeding procedures? There is no incidence in our case because we have not yet released the critically endangered vultures, but Californian condor in USA was also a critically endangered vulture. Only 19 birds were left in the wild. When they caught all 19, kept in captivity, increased their number, and they released them in the wild. But in the before the first releases, they were so fond of these birds that they would, hand feed it, and they would keep the bird near them. So the bird became so habituated of humans that after release, it would go and beg to the humans for food. So we don't want to make that mistake. We have kept them as wild as possible. We don't interact with these birds at all. And so there is no question of their imprinting on us. Now GIB also almost facing the threat in our country, the same way we can save. Yes, we are also working on GIBs in our country. The captive breeding center has started in Jaisalmer in Rajasthan, and we are providing them with a lot of technical expertise. In fact, all the artificial incubation that we do here, we have taught them. Is there any incidence that a vulture? No, vulture imprinting is not possible. Yes, Rani ma'am, any question from you? Have you ever wanted to raise a vulture? Raise a vulture to release it in the wild, yes, but not for our as a pet. No, we would not want them. That's not good for the bird and not good for us also. So,
Ma'am, in this 20 years of research with vulture, how many generations you have seen in your
from one particular pair which nested in 2008, and that pair is still nesting and giving us healthy chicks. So from 2008 to 2020, we have seen like 12 generations from that pair. That's the oldest pair of ours. And now that is the founder stock. Now the F1 stock, that is the chicks that have come out from these, they have also started breeding. So we are having a lot of birds. We have like 370 birds at our center.
So and where do you procure food for all these vultures?
Pardon? From
where do you get the food from?
We, like I told you, we procure goats. So there is a person who arranges goats for us, and he keeps them with himself and for 1 week. And after that, he slaughters and gives them to us. He is the same person that has been working with us from last so many years. The forest department helps us in all this.
Ma'am, if you have got so many 12 generations, then have you actually started doing genetic studies on these birds also?
Yeah, we are doing that also. And we have involved NCBS with us for this genetic studies. So they are working. We provide them with all the blood samples and tissue samples. and very soon we will be
Releasing it.
getting results from them.
So you've not noticed any bottleneck in the population, ma'am, as such. They are
What we do, we all this, no, because we have collected vultures from all over the country. So there is good diversity, and then the siblings, we don't let the siblings remain together. We don't allow any inbreeding. So we remove them and we send them to other centers, so that there is no inbreeding.
okay.
So, ma'am, at a particular point of time, how many people work in that center?
We are 15 of us. So myself and Dr. Prakash and one of our accounts person are common for all the centers. And then we have research biologists and veterinarian and vulture keepers, driver, watchman. But we are very few of us. We are just
Training to which kind of students, ma'am? To college students or school students or research scholars? To whom do you give training?
we would like to employ MSc completed students. And otherwise, if you think that somebody is really interested and it wants to do a dissertation in MSc, then those students can also come to us, and they can work in our center, and from the data that is generated, they can use it for their dissertation. But
How long is the training? How long is the training period?
I think dissertations are for three months. But if you employ a person, then we expect that a person with master's degree would know a lot. So it takes around a month or so for that person to understand the working of the center, and then the person can work independently with us.
Can we extend these techniques to other birds, ma'am?
Yeah, artificial incubation techniques can be kept. How other birds can be kept in captivity can all be, learned from this program. So, in fact, all forest batches, like from IFS till the forest guards, have a captive breeding module for which they are sent to our center, and we explain to them all the conservation breeding. We think that, with so much of development in the country, ultimately the forest areas will shrink so that only some small and forests are left, and then birds species will reduce. So captive breeding will be the ultimate option for all the species, because we are interfering a lot with nature. Who are all the authority of vulture restaurant? How many vulture restaurants are there in India? See, vulture restaurants, we don't think is a good idea, because you are providing food in one particular place, but you don't know where the vultures go to feed, because their territory is like 100 kilometers. And how do you ensure that the food you are providing is diclofenac free? Till today, we have not been able to find that, technique of identifying a carcass which is diclofenac free, because this is a very difficult process. It requires samples to be sent to labs which has that LCMS machine, or in field it is not possible to find out. So today you may be feeding vultures here, but later on vulture can go and feed anywhere. You cannot hold that bird. So a vulture restaurant is not a good idea. And do vultures also molt like eagles and live for long years? Yeah, vultures do molt. In fact, they molt every year. And because of their plumage difference, you can age them from first year till 5 years. After 5 years, a 5-year and a 35-year-old bird will look the same. So in our captive breeding program, we have 70% juveniles, nestlings, and 30% adults, because those 30% adults, you don't know how old they are. But these 70% birds, you can age them. And nobody knows how long the vultures live. We will be the first one to tell, how long these birds can live. But we know that birds with similar ecology, like big birds, and they live for 35, 40 years, like cranes. So we expect that vultures also live that long.
Excuse me, ma'am. Like you have released two birds already, and you told after 45 days you couldn't track them. Did you see them again coming back to your site anytime after that?
No, these two birds, we have not seen them coming to us. But there was a third bird which we had just ringed for some other purpose, like we were doing some NSA testing of tolfenamic acid and we in our center, and we found that tolfenamic acid is also safe for birds. So we had ringed these birds, and three birds from them come to our country. Those are Himalayan griffins. They come every year in winter. So we have been keeping a track because of the ring that we have put on its leg. But not these two particular griffins. No, we could not find them again. But if they have survived for 45 days and they could find their food and water, then we are sure they would be doing well in the wild. So somebody is saying that, ma'am, Padmashini, whenever I see vulture, I'll be eager to learn more about it. Your presentation has made me learn everything about vultures. Now the presentation had made me too even more eager. I was happy while seeing the presentation that reflected your hard work and care. Thank you very much, Padma. Can vultures feed on human corpse? Yes, vultures, Parsis offer their dead to vultures, and vultures feed on the human corpses. That's how they uh, even in the Ganges, the dead bodies are thrown in the Ganga. Vultures feed on them also. So you didn't yet release this vulture pair of two, as you said, you will release them. Yeah, this pair is very good. It is giving us healthy nestlings. So we are not going to see. The plan is that 2 adult birds will be released with a flock of 6 captive bred vultures. Of the 8 vultures that we are releasing this year, and in future we will release them, there will always be a small flock of adult birds. But we would prefer to release non-breeding birds, because the breeding stock is required to replenish, so that continuously, so that we have 600 pairs to release in the wild. So we won't release breeding birds first. We will release the F1 generation.
When different peoples come for training and they go into the room for taking the eggs or something, when the birds react to it, no? You give training for different members, no? The training members, when they go into the room for taking the eggs or whatever, when the bird identify different members are coming and
we don't let them remove eggs and all that, because that is very critical work. It can harm the egg. So, but they can help us in monitoring vultures by CCTV cameras, or in cleaning aviaries. Cleaning also gives you a very good idea about how the birds live, and in doing awareness programs, they can help us that way. But or when I'm doing artificial incubation, maybe in the incubator room I can take their help. Depends on how much interest they have. And I would not take them immediately into to remove eggs, and such things are better to be done by experienced people.
While cleaning pair, they will be shifting the birds to another aviary?
Yeah. So our aviaries are very big aviaries. So when we are cleaning, we work on one side of the aviary, so all birds will fly to the other side, and they remain there. And all our activities are done without any jerks or without alarming the bird. And we always look down while cleaning, so they are comfortable and they are not stressed. And then when we are finished with this, then we go to the other side, so they'll again go back.
Have you ever caught the vulture, ma'am, in the hand, the grown-up ones?
Pardon, have I? All of us hold birds, and we know how to hold them. If you know correctly, then the bird cannot attack you, because the neck is very long, and like a snake, it can come back on you. So you should know how to hold the bird. But in all these years, all of us have been bitten by the vultures. That is part of occupation hazard.